Look, it's incredibly difficult selling to the government. There's just no way around it. And that's why when you talk in Silicon Valley and you talk about, everyone will talk all day about dual use technologies. But realistically, when you go in and talk about getting funded and moving forward on that, venture capitalists, P firms are very skeptical about having a product that's solely focused on defense or government because it's so hard to get into it. Yes, once you get into it, you probably have something you can stick. It's sticky, it'll stay for a while. But the process of getting into it is brutally difficult and expensive.
So, you talk about sort of being on both sides of the table, so to speak, right? Like being more in that like knuckle dragger kind of generalist spot, and then being on the other side in that security expert, that sort of, the senior sort of security person. What do you think some of the biggest sort of misconceptions are or misunderstandings from, maybe the non-security community as they look in or they think about security?
Yeah, one of the things I always like to say is I think we get caught up too often in like the big news, like, nation state actor hacks and massive kind of corporations. And we think, and a lot of times they'll come through and talk like SolarWinds, all the technology in the background that impacted that. And I think we also oftentimes get so focused on the big picture stuff, we lose focus on the foundational pieces, right? And I think the thing that I always kind of bring back to as well is, look, cybersecurity is a highly technical field. However, boil it back down and realize like, look, humans build computers, humans use computers. The problem is not the computer. The computer is following the logic, right? That's not to say you don't need to understand how to configure that and things like that. But like, if you focus on the human dynamics there, you're going to get a lot further along. And that's honestly why I think I really enjoyed shifting into cybersecurity from that knuckle dragging kind of Marine Corps stuff. Is when I was in my grad program, I looked around and I kind of looked at all civilians in there. And I was like, you guys sound like you're Marines. Now, like, what do you mean? It's like, because every time someone puts something in front of you, your immediate instinct is, how do I break that? How do I get around that? Right. And that mindset is really hard to teach. The technology you can teach, but the mindset is really critical.
It's interesting. I find it often when we talk about highly technical, either problems or environments, markets, whatever it may be, so much of it comes down to the people. And I think, all of us are guilty of, hey, there's a tool for that or there's a technology for that. How are you finding sort of assessing, right? One of the hardest, you hear people talk about sort of like 10x hires and the criticality of culture. And so if we take that in on sort of the security angle, and you're living through it a little bit right now, right?
Yeah.
How should somebody, so talk to that CEO, that CISO on the other side of a table, maybe at a slightly earlier company that's trying to think about, how do I go build that team of the right people and instill sort of that right culture? How should they be looking for folks? What are the attributes, I guess, to your point on some of it that you can't teach?
Yeah, no, I think that, what you can't teach is kind of like that healthy paranoia and understanding risk. Where I really would advise people when they're looking at bringing the right people into cybersecurity is make sure the people they bring in understand the risk tolerance of the company and how that culture impacts that, right? And if you're talking about an early startup that maybe doesn't have any cybersecurity expertise, the first step is like pick somebody and put them in charge, right? Like doesn't have to be a CISO, doesn't have to be, just could be a collateral duty, but someone where I'm going to funnel security questions to you and I'm going to like block out time so you can do that. Because a lot of startups and small organizations, nonprofits just kind of put the blinders on and be like, we just can't worry about this, right? And in the reality speaking is at that level, when you first step into the foundational cybersecurity practices like regular training, making sure you have malware protection on your devices, handling passwords securely, using a password manager, putting MFA on everything, like that knocks out 80 to 85% of the threats, right? So can you get the foundational things in? Can you bring someone who can take those and then scale with your business? And the reason why I hit the risk tolerance piece is you look at security as kind of a rheostat, right? Like on one side, it's 100% secure, and on one side, it's 100% convenient. Like if it's 100% convenient, it is totally insecure and you're at severe risk. If it's totally secure, it's totally unusable, right? And what happens the closer you get to that totally secure side, if an employee or teammate can't get their job done, they're going to find a way to get the job done, especially if you hire the right people, right? And then you start spinning out shadow IT and other things, and you lose control. So do you understand the risk appetite of the company? And are you comfortable going in and saying, here's a vulnerability, here's a concern I've seen, here's the cost and process to remediate. Like, where are we going to set the dial here?
Yeah.
Here, okay, got it, and move on.
So I mean, I love the exemplar of the dial. You went exactly where I was going to go with sort of the next question, which is great. So, hey, I've built like this lights out sort of security team, right? And it's to your point about it's going to be so secure, it's, unusable, or it's going to be so usable, it's sort of insecure, null there, right? My question is, how do you find the best sort of outcomes building constituency sort of across that? And then conversely, how do you make sure you're not building like the technical Maginot line that where you're all excited and you're high-fiving yourself because you've built this great thing. And then, if anybody doesn't remember, like the Germans just went around it, like took Paris from the back. How do you avoid, right? How are you building sort of community and building insecurity as a cultural attribute? And how are you making sure that maybe somebody outside of security is sort of giving that vector check on like, yeah, all right, or how are you checking on it? I guess would be the two-part question there.
No, I'll hit the people first. I mean, I think one of the pieces you need to understand is like, you need to build allies in the company, right? And so part of it is are you evangelizing security within? And being that resource. Like, one of the things I hate is you see companies that like, oh, someone clicks something, I'm going to go punish them now. Like, no, like use that as an educational opportunity, right? And if you do it right, you never know. Like, a lot of times when people say like, oh, well, how do you know you weren't hacked? Like, you don't know, right? You just don't know. When you look at the really bad ones out there, usually the attackers have been in your system for months on end doing lateral movement. So like, how do you know? You don't. You're doing all the best things. But if you are actually like engaging with your teammates, you want them to bring issues up to you. Like, my internal temperature dip of whether the security culture is working is when teammates from across the organization are bringing questions to me and my team and saying, hey, I just saw this. This doesn't look right. Or I started doing this, but you said something in onboarding that maybe I should think about this. Like, that's the sign where you can open up and have a conversation and build that piece out. I think that the other challenge is when you start like building and scaling that product out and you start securing it. Again, it goes back to like understand the risk and thinking about it. And it's great that you brought up Maginot Line. I think oftentimes, because it's sometimes difficult to conceptually wrap your head around security, we often talk about like a defense and, like a castle moat structure, right? There's my moat, there's my firewall, there's Absolutely. My door, it's my authentication. And you got to get past that two-dimensional essentially perspective of that and think more of a defense in depth. So when I think it's more like when you're setting up in a military defense, and for the military folks on the line, like, look, you can put an obstacle. If that obstacle is not observed, it's not an obstacle, right? So are you monitoring or alerting on the things you're sitting out there? Are you setting something out that's 2 clicks in advance to slow down and alert the attacker? He hits a trip flare, which allows you to see him before he gets in there. And then let's just say, worst case scenario, plan for him to be inside your network. And then think about what are the things you're doing inside the network, whether you're setting up like canaries or honeypots to kind of trick him, or like implementing an actual fully zero trust thing where someone has to re-authenticate and you're checking him on everything. So the implementation is not, hey, he's inside the walls now, he can have access to everything. Like, no, he's inside the walls. Every other door in the castle is locked. And every door in the castle has a different key to continually check and maintain that. But again, if I have to type in a password 27 times a day, like, that's totally inconvenient. It starts having a problem. So as you're moving to things like passkeys and biometrics and finding ways, you're actually checking and tracking people on a day-to-day basis and making sure, yes, you are supposed to have access to what you're accessing, not just, again, Maginot Line, moat, lock the front door and cross your fingers and hope for the best.
Yeah, I think that building allies is a critical part. And I mean, it also gets at this sort of business unit, that functional outcome of security, which is to build in better behaviors in and around any of those sort of technical solutions or policy solutions we've brought in. I want to spin a little bit and say, hey, so to the teams out there that are maybe new into government or thinking about coming into sort of the public sector space, right? How should they be thinking about it? It's overwhelming for those of us that are in the market to look at the policy and the articles and this coming next and this initiative and this requirement. How should folks think about security and where to get smart and, what does it mean to sort of meet the needs, meet the security sort of requirements of the broader public sector? And it's a generalized question to
Yeah.
sort of let you take it a couple different ways if you want to.
Yeah, no, look, it's incredibly difficult selling to the government. There's just no way around it. And that's why when you talk in Silicon Valley and you talk about, everyone will talk all day about dual use technologies, but realistically, when you go in and talk about getting funded and moving forward on that, venture capitalists, P firms are very skeptical about having a product that's solely focused on defense or government because it's so hard to get into it. Yes, once you get into it, you probably have something you can stick. It's sticky, it'll stay for a while, but the process of getting into it is brutally difficult and expensive. And I think one of the challenges with that is, you might build this super secure product that you think on that, but the piece that's really critical to government is, can you communicate that security to the government, right? The beauty of the government is everything's written down, right? So you can go in and actually like pull down the NIST 853 and kind of go through the controls and get a sense of that. But you should also, as you start having that conversation with government customers, understand like what are they going to accept and what do they need for this to be a successful relationship? Because we've seen this already. It's not just FedRAMP. You talk about DoD ATOs. Every AO is a little different on where their risk tolerance is and how do you match that. I think the key thing that I would tell people to do is don't get caught up in the compliance game, because security and compliance are often used together, but they really are two separate things, right? People often think that, hey, if I check all these boxes and say I've done all these things and all these controls, I'm secure. That's not true, right? Realistically, compliance should be driven from security. Good security should output good compliance, but good compliance almost never outputs really good security,
Yeah.
So understanding that kind of that yin yang, that zen kind of back and forth with those two, and then being able to nail down like, what do I actually need to do and where do I need to be compliant? Am I smart enough to kind of depict that to the auditors, the people I work with in the government? Because again, the NIST guidance is very good. However, like it's adapting, right? I mean, all those guidelines were written for like bare metal servers, right? And then they were adapted to the cloud. And now we're in a Kubernetes and container driven architecture where it's still kind of catching up. And some of those controls don't exactly align that. So being able to read the control and understand and translate how you use security in your system is a critical kind of need for a company that's trying to go that route.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the leading sort of lagging relationship between regulations and sort of environmental or market realities is that you see on such a main stage in public sector because there are, years between new initiatives and things like that. Sort of
I was saying one other thing on that too. I mean, the same thing with the legal side, right? I think we were talking beforehand, like all of the legal prosecutions the FBI has brought recently and going on, they're all tied to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986, right? So it's a 37-year-old document. Yeah, it was updated in the early 2000s, but still, like, we haven't moved forward to where we're like thinking more deeply about how do we write the laws and regulations and how we do it to stay in the pace of technology. I think the rule that was tossed to me in grad school was like regulation usually trails 7 years behind technology. I mean, like, think about the past 7 years of technology or the 7 years before that, and regulation trying to catch up in that realm, right?
Oh, yeah. No, and I mean, look, like, and I mean this probably is as pokey as it sounds, but, and I'll say this is like the biggest advocate of national security ever. Like, every time I think about effectively regulating cybersecurity, I'm drawn back to that congressional hearing where Congress is trying to understand Facebook and like YouTube.
Yeah. Like flipping cards. Yep.
Oh my God. Oh, it's like we're all dead. Like,
yeah, I mean,
funny story, like the internet.
That hearing occurred while I was in a live session of grad school. And it was actually like in our legal and privacy and compliance course. And they literally stopped the course and just put it on the screen. And we watched it with another cohort, and the whole thing, like all these cyber professionals are just like shaking their head. They're like, oh my God. Yeah. And it's like, look, this isn't like the poke at Congress, right? But it's just like, that means we failed at communicating. We failed to like engage and educate and build it. And that kind of goes back to it. It's like, you can't be someone who just goes into security and says, shuts the door. No, you don't understand. We're not letting you in. Like, how are you evangelizing? How are you engaging?
Goes back to your point about building allies. It's bigger than just organizational. We've got to educate the market, educate the regulators on what that looks like.
Bingo. And like one of the things you see inside like companies, larger companies, a lot of times they build out BISOs or business information security officers, right? That are set in those different business units. They find someone who understands security and likes it, gives them an additional role. and that becomes the conduit for security to engage, enable, and support, facilitate that business unit. Like, we need to think, how do we do that outside of the standard, like lobbying and congressional action pieces? How do we find a way to basically walk in from the industry and help educate legislatures and regulators so that they have the information they need to properly write it? Because, like, look, we need regulation. We need legal parameters on this stuff. We just need to be good ones, right? And that some of that responsibility is on us.
Yeah.